We can now proceed with the explosion simulation. And this is the situation where we discarded all of the simulations. Additionally, the sphere had already been broken, and the simulation had been baked to keyframes. We've already seen how to implement a smoke simulation. Here, we'll look at how to add fire and flames. In addition, we'll experiment with different ways to generate smoke and fire. Previously, we created a mesh to serve as the source. But in this case, the fire source will be a particle system. This is extremely useful for giving the simulation a more energetic appearance, which is exactly what we need for an explosion. I'm going to start by placing a sphere in the center of the glass ball. We couldn't get a very energetic simulation if we used this as the only fire source. Of course, we could calibrate some parameters like velocity, forces, and so on. But this is not what we are looking for. The best way to accomplish this is to allow the ball to emit particles, and then use these particles as smoke and fire emitters. We'll end up with something that looks like an explosion. Well, select the sphere and create a new particle system. It must be set to emitter mode. Reduce the total number of particles. Set the start and end points of the simulation as well. This has to be a short range of frames, as the particles have not to be continuously emitted. They must behave like a real explosion, which occurs very quickly. We also need to reduce the particle lifetime. We can actually define the simulation's behavior in the Velocity tab. The first step is to increase the normal velocity. It is the velocity perpendicular to each of the emitter's faces. As a result, particles will be emitted in all directions. They also vanish after a few frames, which is exactly what we want. Increase the randomize factor as well. In this case, no rotation is required. We can also keep the other parameters at their current values. We must now include another particle system that represents a secondary explosion. We can see in the final rendering that there are some minor explosions shortly after the main one. I also want to give this second explosion a more defined direction. To do so, I'll add a simple plane and rotate it in the direction I want the particles to be emitted. Let's add a new particle system and set an initial frame right after the main explosion. Modify the normal velocity once more to give the particles an initial velocity. Well, this is the result after adjusting the parameters. We can also rename the particle system settings to make them easier to find if we want to apply it to another source. Let's make a duplicate of this particle system, relocate it to the opposite side, and alter some parameters to produce some variations in behavior. However, before we do so, we should make these settings specific to this source. Otherwise, we are modifying the parameters of the other particle system as well. We must now convert this into a fire and smoke simulation. And, as we already know, the first step is to add a domain. Also, remember to change the frame where the simulation begins. Now we have to convert the particle systems in the fire and smoke emitters. The flow behavior must be inflow, and the flow type must be fire and smoke. This is different to what was done previously, when we only had smoke to simulate. The final step is to change the flow source to particle system and select the particle system we created. And we must repeat the process for the remaining sources. And here is the end result. Well, as we can see, the fire and smoke are no longer emitted by a single object, but by a large number of particles. As a result, the simulation appears more realistic and energetic. Now we must tweak the parameters to achieve the desired result. To keep things simple, I'll only show one explosion, to give you a better view of the simulation. To see the update, remember that every time you change a simulation parameter, you must reset it by changing the resolution division parameter. Also, keep in mind that in order to hide a simulation, you must hide both the simulation and the associated particle system. So far, all we can see is the explosion of the glass ball. We have a fire simulation specific attribute in the simulation parameters. It's the fuel setting. As a result, the higher this value, the stronger the fire, as it can rely on more fuel. In this way, we can give our three simulations different looks and energies. Another interesting parameter can be found in the flow source section. It's the size one, and is proportional to the physical size of each particle emitting fire. When I increase this value to 2, each emitter grows in size. This is also useful for distinguishing the main explosion from the secondary ones. And here's a test with a very low size property value. Remember that what you see here is also determined by the resolution we set. In this case, the value is 32, and the size of the emitters cannot be smaller than this voxel value. We get a more detailed view of the simulation when we increase the resolution. Well, let's return to our emitter. And here we must consider another crucial property: the sampling substeps, to be specific. We talked about it during the smoke simulation. We discovered that this parameter is useful when dealing with a fast-moving volume. It is, indeed, related to the number of calculations performed by Blender for each frame. And here we can see what happens when we have a fast emitter. The trail does not appear to be continuous, but rather a series of steps. This is because the emitter moves quickly, and Blender cannot compute the simulation at the same rate. However, increasing the sampling substeps clearly shows that we now have more steps, and the simulation is computed more frequently. On the other hand, I'd like to emphasize that the pixelated appearance of the smoke is due to its resolution. It is also critical to enable the initial velocity property. This will add some velocity from the emitter to the smoke and fire. As a result, they will travel in the same direction as the particles. We can see this better if we increase the resolution. And here when I also increased the particle size. We can also alter the appearance of the simulation by adjusting the ratio of smoke to flames. The density parameter allows us to increase or decrease the amount of smoke. And, as previously mentioned, the strength of fire with the fuel property. Now we must consider the domain parameters. As a first step, we should increase it to cover the entire volume required for the simulation. As with the fire source, we have a parameter related to the number of calculations. It's called the time step property. When dealing with fast-moving smoke, increasing the maximum and minimum values can be beneficial. However, since we have already increased the sampling subtests in the emitter, we can leave it at its default value for the time being. Then there's the time scale setting. It essentially increases or decreases the animation speed. Reducing the speed, in my opinion, can often result in a more cinematographic look and style. We don't need to enable border collisions. We've already discussed the adaptive domain property. It basically increases or decreases the volume of the domain to improve performance. However, in some cases, it can result in clipping issues. As a result, I usually leave this option turned off. We can change how the smoke moves here. It has the ability to move faster or slower. And now we come to the fire parameters. The reaction speed is proportional to the rate of fuel consumption. Increasing this value means that the fuel is consumed quickly and that the flames cannot expand much. Lowering this value causes the flames to rise higher. Keep in mind that these properties are related to the domain or the entire simulation. When we change a value here, it affects the entire simulation within the volume. If you want to change the appearance of a specific simulation, you can change the parameters of that emitter. The flame smoke is proportional to the amount of smoke emitted. There is more smoke emitted here. We have vorticity as well. It is similar to what we have for smoke, so we can distinguish its value for smoke and fire. Then there are the maximum and minimum temperatures. They are referring to the maximum temperature that can be reached. And, of course, the higher the temperature, the stronger the flames. We've already discussed the guides and the cache. We'll use modular as the cache type for the final simulation. We'll also enable the noise option. As we saw when discussing smoke properties, it is critical to provide more details to the simulation. Finally, the resolution divisions will be increased. It should be between 128 and 256 for best results. Let's look at how to create the material. This is the node setup we configured for the smoke material. I also added a color ramp node here. This allows me to better control the density distribution. If you consider the density to be a grayscale image, I can adjust the contrast by adjusting the associated levels. But now we must add the fire material. And in order to do so, we should enable the black body property. A fire material works essentially by assigning a different color to the temperature of the fire in a specific area. And the simplest way to do so is to activate and increase the value of the black body property. Based on its temperature, this automatically assigns a different color to the volume. It is also physically correct. We can see it better if we turn off the smoke. We can also modify the temperature setting. This is a global temperature multiplier. The higher the temperature, the lighter and whiter the material. This is based on the temperature parameter, which can be seen here. Blender uses this attribute to determine the temperature distribution within the volume. The same idea as we saw with the density attribute. Blender won't be able to determine the appropriate shader if we dismiss this parameter. But it is interesting to note that we can use other attributes in the place of temperature. To compute the temperature distribution, for example, we can use the heat or density attributes. And this produces different effects. However, we have another workflow for changing the color of fire. It also gives us more flexibility in defining the shader we want. It is based on the emission strength parameter. It allows the volume to emit light. Set the black body intensity to 0. The emission strength value can now be increased. At the same time, we must change the color of the emission. If it is black, there is no emission. But, for the time being, the entire volume emits the same amount of light. As for the black body, I want to define a mask, based on the predefined Blender attributes. Let's start by adding the standard attribute node. We can select what kind of attribute to use here. And we are already aware of what they are. Basically, temperature, density, and heat. We can now assign a color gradient to this distribution by connecting this attribute to a color ramp node. Connect it to the emission color input to create your own fire shader. I got better results when I used density as a mask attribute. We can now precisely set the colors we want, rather than being limited to the standard colors produced by the black body property. Let's turn on the smoke again. It completely overcomes the fire. We have the option of increasing the emission strength factor. Now it's just a matter of optimizing the different parameters in order to get the exact material we want. This is how you can create your own shader.